In the winter of 1873, when the frosts of East Anglia clung to the hedgerows like lace and the fen mists rose earlier, each dusk to swallow the last amber light of afternoon, the village of Ashcombe lay cloaked in a silence so absolute it seemed less a place inhabited than a memory suspended in glass. Stone cottages huddled beneath thatch stiffened by ice, their chimneys exhaling thin plumes into a sky already bruised with twilight. At the crest of the hill beyond the skeletal oaks and the blackened spire of St. Etheldreda seats, bell long cracked and silent stood Blackwood Hall, a Jacobean manor whose once proud façade had slumped over the centuries into an air of genteel decay. Its bricks, darkened by lichen and rain, leaned inward as though burdened by secrets too heavy to speak aloud. Ivy, thick as a funeral shroud, climbed the west wing where the windows had been shuttered since before the Great Exhibition. Inside, dust lay undisturbed upon pianos, upon portrait frames, upon the brittle pages of books whose bindings cracked at the mere suggestion of touch. It was to this house that Lady Eleanor Winthrop returned in the autumn of that year, following the unexpected death of her elder brother, the Earl of Blackwood. She arrived not with mourning veils and retinue as custom dictated, but alone in a hired carriage from King's Lynn, her face pale beneath a bonnet trimmed with jet beads, her hands folded tightly in her lap as if holding something within her ribs from spilling out. The villagers who saw her through their frost-veiled panes noted the absence of luggage, the absence of servants, even the absence of grief in the usual forms. No tears were shed at the churchyard where her brother was interred beside their parents. She stood at the graveside with a stillness that bordered on defiance, her eyes fixed not on the fresh-turned earth but on the distant silhouette of the hall, as though measuring the distance between herself and some private reckoning. Eleanor had been absent from Ashcombe for nearly a decade, sent abroad at 17 under vague pretenses of delicate health and continental education, a common euphemism for inconvenient young women of noble blood. In Switzerland, she had been rumored to paint; in Florence, to have received suitors; in Paris, to have vanished for months into the company of obscure spiritualists. None of these tales reached Ashcombe with certainty, for the Winthrops had long since retreated from society, their names spoken only in hushed tones when the rents were due or when the harvest failed yet again. The Earldom itself, once prosperous through wool and fen drainage, had dwindled to a handful of tenant farms and a title sustained only by the brittle parchment of lineage. With the Earl's death, the male line was extinguished, and with it, the estate's legal claim to the crown's recognition. Unless a direct heir could be produced, unless a new Earl rose from the Winthrop blood, the lands would be absorbed by the treasury, the hall dismantled stone by stone, and the family name erased as though it had never been. And so, 3 weeks after the burial, a notice appeared in the Times, a quiet, almost apologetic announcement. Lady Eleanor Winthrop, only sister of the late Earl, had consented to marry her cousin, Mr. Alistair Winthrop, a distant relation from the Devon branch, whose claim to the title, though tenuous, was deemed sufficient by the College of Arms to preserve the dignity of the peerage. The wedding was to take place in the family chapel, with no guests beyond the local vicar and 2 witnesses drawn from the estate staff. Yet even before the ink on the banns had dried, rumors whispered through the village smokehouses and the damp corners of the Black Bull Inn. Mr. Alistair Winthrop bore too close a resemblance to the late Earl, not merely in feature, but in gait, in voice, in the slow way he lit his pipe with his left hand, just as the Earl had. More troubling still was the fact that no one in Devon seemed to recall an Alistair Winthrop. The solicitors in London produced documents, of course birth certificates, letters of introduction, a faded miniature, but the paper smelled faintly of camphor as though preserved rather than used, and the ink on the signatures bore the sheen of recent application. Eleanor, for her part, spoke to no one. She was seen walking the perimeter of the walled garden at dawn, her gloved fingers trailing along the frostbitten rose stems, her breath clouding in the still air. She took her meals alone in the morning room, the curtains drawn against the day, and at night, candlelight flickered behind the third-floor window of the old nursery, long unused. Servants reported the sound of piano keys being pressed softly without melody, as though someone were testing whether the instrument remembered how to speak. Once the housekeeper claimed to have glimpsed Eleanor standing at the top of the grand staircase, dressed not in her mourning black but in a gown of ivory silk, her hair unbound and falling past her shoulders, though the wedding was still weeks away. When challenged, the girl stammered that she must have been mistaken, that it was only moonlight playing tricks through the clear story, but she resigned her post the following morning and did not wait for her wages. The unease deepened with the arrival of the wedding day itself. It snowed lightly that morning, an uncommon occurrence for late November, and the chapel bells, silent for years, was said to have tolled once, though no hand touched the rope. The ceremony was conducted in under 20 minutes. The vicar, old Mr. Hargrove, who had baptized every Winthrop child for 3 generations later, confided to his diary that he had felt an inexplicable pressure upon his chest as he pronounced the couple man and wife, as though the very words carried a weight they were never meant to bear. He noted, too, that Eleanor did not speak her vows, but merely inclined her head, a gesture so slight it might have been mistaken for a shiver. Alistair, for his part, smiled throughout, a fixed and polished expression that never reached his eyes, which remained dark and still as river stones. There was no feast afterward, no music, no toasts. The newlyweds retired directly to the hall, and by nightfall all lights were extinguished save one in the West Wing study room that had not been entered since the Earl's death. In the weeks that followed, the estate appeared to revive, repairs began on the roof, debts were settled with uncanny promptness, and Alistair, now styled as acting Earl, was seen riding the boundaries with a vigor that belied his supposed years. Yet those who encountered him closely spoke of a disquieting smoothness to his manner, as though his gestures had been rehearsed rather than lived. He never addressed Eleanor by name, only as my dear, and never touched her in public. She in turn grew quieter, her walks shorter, her face more withdrawn, until she seemed less a woman than a figure painted onto the landscape, a wisp of ivory and shadow lingering at the edge of vision. And then, abruptly, Alistair vanished. It happened on the first night of February. A stable boy, fetching oats for the morning feed, found the master's bed unslept in, the fire cold, the door to the study ajar. On the desk lay a single sheet of paper, blank save for a wax seal bearing the Winthrop crest to ravens flanking an oak tree pressed with such force that the wax had cracked like old bone. No search was mounted. No constable was summoned. Eleanor herself gave no order, made no inquiry. She simply took to wearing her widow's black once more, though she was barely 2 months a wife, and resumed her solitary walks in the garden now with a peculiar ritual. Each evening she would place a single white camellia upon the stone bench by the sundial, though no camellias grew in Ashcombe and no florist for 50 miles could account for their sudden appearance. Years passed, the acting Earl was never mentioned again. The estate, though outwardly restored, carried a hollowness beneath its polished floors and fresh paint, a sense that time itself had stuttered within those walls. Children dared not play near the hall's gates. Dogs would not bark when its silhouette darkened the western hill. And Eleanor remained, growing neither older nor younger in the villages, telling, a presence as constant and unchanging as the ash tree that stood sentinel over the family plot. She died in 1891, not in her bed, but seated upright in the morning room, a book open on her lap, a hand resting upon a page that, when examined, contained only a single line of music, notation 3 notes descending, unresolved, and beneath it, in a hand not her own, the words "as we vowed." The house stood empty after that, though not abandoned. Lights were seen in the upper windows on moonless nights. Servants hired to air the rooms claimed to hear footsteps pacing the gallery long after curfew, always to sets, always falling out of step. And once, in 1902, a local antiquarian searching for estate records discovered, hidden behind a false panel in the library, a locked tin box containing a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. The ink was blurred in places, the paper fragile as moth wings, but the contents were legible enough to unsettle even the most rational mind. Letters not from Alistair to Eleanor, nor from her to him, but from Eleanor to her brother, the late Earl, writ months after his burial, addressed to my beloved Arthur, signed your wife E. The discovery of those letters, now held under restricted seal at the Suffolk County Archives, did not, at first, provoke alarm. To the casual eye, they read as the grief-stricken ramblings of a sister undone by loss, her pen spilling affection too fervent for mere kinship, yet not so explicit as to breach the bounds of Victorian propriety. Your absence is a silence I cannot tune, one began, and the house echoes with the ghost of your laugh, which I alone remember true. Another spoke of dreams in which they walked the Umays together as children, hand in hand, though now the path led not to the summer house but to a chapel draped in white roses where a vow waited long unspoken yet always known. Such sentiments, though intimate, might be dismissed as poetic melancholy were it not for the dates. Each letter bore a postscript in a second hand, neat and angular, matching neither Eleanor's looping script nor any known correspondence of the late Earl. These additions were brief, clinical almost. Received January 12, 1874, or acknowledged. Await further instruction. None were signed. Yet the paper on which they were written matched exactly the stationery used by the acting Earl during his brief tenure, a watermark of intertwined ravens visible only when held to candlelight. More troubling still was the existence of a small leather-bound journal, tucked beneath the letters, its cover worn smooth with handling. Its pages contained not entries, but transcriptions, meticulous copies of church records, land deeds, and family trees, all centered on the Winthrop line. Marginalia crowded the margins in Eleanor's hand, dense with annotations in Latin and French referencing obscure canon law dispensations, granted by defunct dioceses, and a curious phrase that recurred like a refrain sanguis. Extinguous custos, blood and soul keeper. Interspersed among these notes were sketches, floor plans of the hall with rooms marked in red ink, astrological charts aligned with birth dates, and, most unnervingly, a series of diagrams depicting two figures joined not by hands or rings, but by a single circlet placed upon both their heads, a crown too small for two, yet worn as one. One page bore a list of names, all female, stretching back to the reign of James I, each followed by the word failed, except the last Eleanor's, followed by a single question mark. Witnesses from the period, when later interviewed by amateur genealogists in the early 1920s, recalled oddities that had seemed trivial at the time. Mrs. Gable, the vicaress' wife, mentioned that during the wedding service, the ring Alistair placed on Eleanor's finger was not gold, but a dull grey metal cold to the touch, and far too large, yet it did not slip from her hand. Old Tom, the gamekeeper, swore he saw the couple standing at midnight in the orchard 3 nights before the ceremony, not speaking, not touching, but facing a freshly dug patch of earth where no tree had been planted. And Bessie Croft, the scullery maid, claimed that after the wedding, Eleanor began sleeping with the door to her chamber barred from the inside, yet every morning the key would be found resting on the hall table clean dry, and turned once in the lock, though no one had entered. Then there were the sounds, not screams or cries, but absences of sound so profound they became presences in themselves. Neighbors spoke of nights when the wind would cease abruptly at the boundary of Blackwood land, as though the estate lay beneath an invisible bell jar. Within the hall, clocks would stop at precisely 3:17 a.m., the hour, according to the death certificate, when the Earl had drawn his last breath. Servants reported that mirrors in the west wing would fog without cause even in summer, and when wiped clear, faint tracings sometimes remained, a single initial A, or the outline of a hand pressed flat against the glass from the other side. Most persistent was the music, the same 3-note phrase Eleanor had been found with upon her death. The housekeeper once traced it to the music room, only to find the piano lid closed and locked, the keys untouched. A local tuner, summoned to restore the instrument, declared it perfectly in tune, though no one has played it in years, and refused further work, muttering about notes that linger after they're struck. Perhaps the most telling artifact was a small silver locket, discovered in 1899 by a boy climbing the ruined garden wall. It contained no portrait, only a lock of hair, dark, fine, and braided with a strand of something coarser, almost grey. When tested decades later by a forensics expert at Cambridge, the strands were confirmed to be human, and genetically nearly identical, consistent with siblings, possibly even the same individuals sampled at different ages. The locket itself bore an inscription on the inner rim, worn nearly smooth: "Nonst, nec mort quidem, we shall not be parted," not even by death. Yet for all these fragments, no coherent narrative emerged, only a mosaic of disquiet, each piece glinting with implication but refusing to form a whole. The legal marriage to Alistair Winthrop remained on record, unchallenged by church or crown. The estate passed smoothly to a distant cousin upon Eleanor's death, and Blackwood Hall, though increasingly neglected, stood as a monument to ordinary aristocratic decline. It was not until 1936, when the building was slated for demolition to make way for a new railway spur, that a workman tearing up the floorboards of the study uncovered a hidden compartment beneath the hearthstone. Inside lay a single sheet of vellum, brittle with age, sealed with the same Ravenandoke emblem. The document was not a will, nor a confession, but a ritual protocol written in ecclesiastical Latin, signed by a bishop whose diocese had been dissolved in 1688, and witnessed by 2 names struck through with black ink so thick it bled through the page. The text outlined a ceremony not of marriage, but of continuatio personae, the continuation of a single soul through dual vessels, sustained by blood allegiance and sealed by mutual oath. The final clause specified that the union must be enacted within 1 year of the primary vessel's death, and that the secondary vessel designated by birth and vow must consent freely, lest the house remember what the law forgets. The discovery was quietly suppressed by the railway company, which had no desire to halt progress over medieval superstition. The vellum vanished into a private collection, and the story might have ended there, entombed once more beneath brick and rail, had it not caught the attention of Dr. Alistair Croft, not to be confused with the Winthrop Claimant, a lecturer in historical jurisprudence at Oxford, and a distant nephew of the scullery maid who had once cleaned Eleanor's chamber. Dr. Croft himself, a man of precise habits and skeptical temperament, was drawn not by ghost stories, but by the legal anomaly. How could a peerage be preserved through a marriage that appeared, upon closer inspection, to have no legitimate groom? His inquiries began as academic curiosity. They would end in obsession. He tracked the vellum's provenance through auction records and private correspondence, eventually locating a partial transcription in the papers of a defrocked Anglican canon who had served briefly in East Anglia in the 1880s. He interviewed aging villagers, cross-referenced burial registers with birth records, and spent weeks in the National Archives piecing together the Winthrops' financial collapse. Slow bleed accelerated not by poor harvests, but by sudden unexplained payments to a society for ecclesiastical preservation based in Brussels, an organization that existed only on paper. Most crucially, he uncovered a sealed probate file, opened briefly in 1874 and then resealed by order of the Lord Chancellor's office. Though he could not access its contents, the docket number corresponded to a single item, a deposition from the local physician, Dr. Edwin Mallory, who had attended both the Earl and Eleanor in their final days. Mallory's testimony had been stricken from public record, but his private diary, preserved by his descendants, contained one cryptic entry dated February 3, 1874. Visited Blackwood. Saw what cannot be. He walks but does not breathe. She speaks but does not listen. God forgive us, we let them choose silence over scandal. Dr. Croft grew pale and thin in those months. Colleagues noted he began wearing gloves indoors, as though warding off a chill only he could feel. He took to carrying a small brass pocket watch that he would not wind, claiming it kept time better that way. And once, during a lecture on testamentary law, he paused mid-sentence, stared out the window toward the east, and whispered, "They didn't marry a cousin. They married the silence between two names." He published nothing of his findings. Instead, he began visiting Ashcombe every full moon, walking the perimeter of the derelict hall with a notebook and a camera obscura documenting the way moonlight pooled in the windows like liquid silver, always thickest in the West Wing study. He was last seen on the night of October 12, 1937. His bicycle was found leaning against the garden gate, his satchel open on the path, its contents spilled, maps, transcripts, and a single white camellia, fresh and unfrozen, though the first frost had come weeks before. He was never found. His notes, however, survived hidden in a false bottom of his desk drawer, wrapped in black silk, and sealed with wax bearing the imprint of two intertwined rings. Dr. Croft's disappearance might have been dismissed as another tragedy swallowed by the Fen's indifferent Myron. Other scholar lost to melancholy or misadventure had his notes not surfaced 3 years later in the possession of Miss Helena Vane, a librarian at the Badleian with a quiet reputation for retrieving the unfindable. She claimed to have received them anonymously in a parcel wrapped in oilcloth, tied with twine that smelled faintly of camphor and beeswax. Inside, beneath layers of unbleached linen, lay not only Croft's meticulous transcriptions but a new edition, a slim folio bound in what appeared to be human skin, its surface cool and slightly yielding to the touch, embossed with the Winthrop crest and tarnished silver leaf. The pages within were not handwritten, but printed in a typeface no longer in use, a variant of Caslan employed only by ecclesiastical presses before 1820, and bore the heading Testimonium Sanguinis, or Testimony of Blood. The document detailed not a single event, but a lineage of obligation. According to its account, the Winthrops had, since the dissolution of the monasteries, served as custodians of a private vow made not to crown or church, but to something older, a pact sealed during the plague years when the then head of the family, Sir Reginald Winthrop, had bartered the future of his line for the survival of his estate. The terms were vague, couched in allegory. When the male branch withers, the root must graft itself anew. The heir must wear the face of the fallen, and the sister must become the vessel of continuity. For generations, the clause remained dormant, invoked only in whispers during times of succession crisis. In 1692, a Lady Margaret Winthrop was said to have vanished for 6 weeks following her brother's death, returning pale and silent, only to die in childbirth a year later, her infant stillborn, its features reportedly indistinct, as though not yet decided. In 1789, another Eleanor, the name recurred with unsettling frequency, was quietly confined to a private asylum in Bath after insisting her late brother visited her nightly to discuss the harvest. Official records listed her cause of death as nervous exhaustion, but the asylum's ledger noted, in a marginal scroll, refused to eat, claimed food tasted of grave soil. What distinguished the 1873 incident was not its occurrence, but its execution. Previous attempts had failed because the sister could not or would not consent freely. The pact required not coercion but willing surrender, a voluntary merging of identity, sealed by ritual and sustained by silence. The late Earl Arthur Winthrop had understood this. His letters to Eleanor, intercepted by Dr. Croft from a private collection in Gentreville, a man not merely resigned to death, but preparing for transference. "Do not mourn me," he wrote in March 1873, "but remember how I walked, how I held my teacup, how I hummed that tune from the yeoman of the guard. These are the threads you must hold when the veil grows thin," he instructed her in specific gestures, phrases, even the angle at which to tilt her head when listening, a behavioral mimicry so precise it blurred the line between memory and manifestation. And crucially, he urged her to find the one who carries my echo, not a stranger, but a vessel already attuned by blood and upbringing. This, the testimonium suggested, was where logic fractured. Alistair Winthrop was never a cousin from Devon. He was Arthur reconstituted, not resurrected in flesh, but re-anchored through Eleanor's unwavering recognition. The marriage was not to a man, but to a role. The ring, not a symbol of union, but a seal of continuity. Witnesses recalled Alistair's uncanny familiarity with the estate's hidden passages, his instinctive knowledge of which drawer held the spare key to the wine cellar, his habit of tapping 3 times on the study door before entering Arthur's old signal. Even his voice, when heard through closed doors, carried the same slight rasp from a childhood bout of diphtheria. Yet the resemblance was never perfect. Servants noted that Alistair never ate meat, though Arthur had relished roast beef, that he avoided mirrors, whereas Arthur had been vain about his profile, that his left hand, though it lit pipes like Arthur's, trembled slightly when pouring tea. Detail Eleanor corrected with a murmured word, after which the shaking ceased. The pattern deepened when cross-referenced with auditory anomalies reported in the hall. In 1875, a traveling phonograph salesman demonstrated his new Edison machine to the local gentry. When his device was tested in the Blackwood music room, it recorded not the expected parlor song but a fragment of male speech, buried beneath static, ... must not falter. She is listening. The voice matched no living resident. More disturbingly, when the cylinder was played back in reverse, a technique the salesman employed to clean faulty recordings, it produced a female voice whispering, "I am here. I am holding you." The cylinder vanished before it could be analyzed further, but the salesman's logbook, preserved in a museum in Birmingham, recorded his final note on the entry: "Never again in that house. The heir fights the machine." Dr. Croft, in his final addendum, had begun to suspect that the phenomenon was not supernatural in the conventional sense, but psychological mass hallucination sustained by collective complicity. The villagers, eager to preserve their livelihoods, accepted Alistair without question. The clergy, reluctant to challenge a peerage marriage, performed the rites without scrutiny. Even the London solicitors, upon receiving the Winthrop documents, processed them with unusual haste as though eager to close the file. But Croft's theory unraveled when he examined the financial trail more closely. Payments ceased the moment Alistair disappeared, not because the estate could no longer afford them, but because the Society for Ecclesiastical Preservation no longer demanded them. It was as if the debt had been settled not in coin, but in silence. His last known entry, scrawled on the back of a railway timetable, read, "They did not deceive us. We allowed ourselves to be deceived, because the truth was more terrible, that love, when twisted by duty, becomes a kind of haunting." She did not marry her brother. She became his echo, and in doing so, erased herself. He had begun to notice changes in his own reflection, moments when his eyes seemed to dark, his posture too stiff, his handwriting developing a slight loop on the lowercase e that mirrored Eleanor's. He stopped shaving on the left side of his face. He started humming the three-note phrase in his sleep. And in his final letter to Miss Vane of assent, but found pinned to the inside of his journal, he wrote, "If I do not return, burn everything, except the camellia. The camellia must be returned to the sundial." The folio in human skin contained one final revelation: a list of dates corresponding to each attempted continuation, followed by a single word: success or failure. All bore the mark of failure, until 1874. That entry read only, "Silent, enduring." Below it, in a different ink, someone, perhaps Eleanor, perhaps Croft, had added, "The house remembers what the law forgets, but only if someone listens." Miss Helena Vane did not burn the papers. Instead, she transcribed them in cipher, concealed the originals within the hollowed spine of a 17th century book of common prayer, and deposited it in the restricted stacks under a false accession number known only to her. For 23 years, she spoke of Blackwood Hall to no one, not even when wartime evacuees were billeted in the East Anglian countryside and rumors flared anew about the ghost house on the hill. She retired in 1961, a quiet woman with silver hair and eyes that startled visitors with their stillness, and moved to a cottage on the edge of Ashcombe, where she could see the Hall's silhouette from her window each dawn. There, in solitude, she began her own investigation, not with academic detachment, but with the patient obsession of one who senses she has been chosen by the silence rather than the noise. Her method was not archival, but sensory. She walked the overgrown paths at twilight, noting where the frost lingered longest, where the wind changed direction without cause, where certain patches of earth refused to grow even weeds. She collected rainwater from the gutters of the derelict hall, and had it analyzed. The results showed trace elements of belladonna and wormwood, plants not native to the region. She interviewed the last living person to have seen Eleanor leave a farmer's widow named Agnes Pritchard, who, as a girl, had delivered milk to the back door, and remembered the lady's hands, always cold even in summer, and her wedding band. It wasn't gold. It was like polished slate, and it left a mark on her finger. Not a dent, but a kind of shadow, as if the ring had leached the color from her skin. Most significantly, Miss Vane began recording sound, using a portable reel-to-reel gifted to her by a former student. She made weekly visits to the hall between 1963 and 1967, capturing hours of ambient noise, the creak of floorboards, the sigh of wind through broken panes, the distant hoot of owls. On playback, however, anomalies emerged. Beneath the natural sounds, faint but consistent, ran a low harmonic drone, 3 notes, always the same, always descending. When filtered through a resonator, the notes resolved into a fragment of a folk air once common in Norfolk: "Come away, come away, come away, death draws near." The original melody was cheerful, meant for harvest dances. Here, it was rendered in a minor key, tempo slowed to a funereal crawl, and always cutting off just before resolution. Her journals from this period reveal a mind slowly tilting toward the edge of rationality. She began sleeping with the window open, regardless of weather, to hear if they walked tonight. She stopped wearing mirrors in her home, claiming reflections lie more than people, and she developed a ritual of placing a white camellia on her writing desk every new moon, never explaining where she obtained them, for no greenhouse in the county admitted to growing them out of season. Yet her work remained scrupulously documented. She cross-referenced Dr. Croft's notes with ecclesiastical records from Rome and uncovered a suppressed 17th century inquiry into illicit unions of consanguinity under pretense of spiritual necessity, a phrase that appeared in no English canon law but recurred in clandestine Jesuit correspondence concerning recusant families who believed lineage purity could ward off divine punishment. The Winthrops, though nominally Anglican by the 19th century, had Catholic sympathies during the interregnum, and their private chapel had once housed a hidden altar stone, now lost. More compelling was her discovery of a forgotten clause in the original 1612 entail of the Blackwood estate, buried in a marginal gloss written in Latin shorthand. It stipulated that, should the male issue fail without lawful heir, the estate shall pass not to collateral blood, but to the sister who vows to keep the gate, a phrase that made no legal sense yet echoed Eleanor's journal notation sanguis et solius custos. Keep the gate was not metaphorical. Miss Vane found references in local folklore to the Winthrop Gate, a now vanished stone arch that once stood at the eastern boundary of the estate, inscribed with symbols resembling reversed Latin crosses and entwined serpents. According to a 1790 vicar's diary, villagers would leave offerings there during times of plague or blight, not flowers, but locks of hair tied with black thread. The gate was dismantled in 1820, its stones repurposed for a bridge over the River Lark, which collapsed mysteriously in 1872, weeks before the Earl's death. Divers sent to recover the wreckage reported hearing voices underwater, though no bodies were found. Miss Vane's breakthrough came not from paper, but from absence. While cataloguing the hall's remaining fixtures in 1965, she noticed that every room contained at least one mirror except the West Wing study. Even the servants' quarters had cracked shards hung above washbasins, but the study, where the Earl had died and Alistair had spent his final night, held none. When she inquired among the oldest villagers, she learned that Arthur Winthrop had removed all mirrors from that wing shortly before his illness, claiming they showed the wrong version of time. Eleanor, upon her return, never replaced them. Miss Vane hypothesized that the pact required a deliberate severance from self-reflection, a surrender of individual identity so complete that even the sight of one's own face became a threat to continuity. This explained Alistair's aversion to glass, Eleanor's refusal to sit for portraits after 1873, and Dr. Croft's late-life mirror avoidance. Her final act of investigation was both scholarly and sacrificial. In the winter of 1967, she entered the hall during a new moon, and spent the night in the study, armed only with her recorder, a candle, and a single white camellia. Her journal entry the following morning, her last, was brief. "They are not ghosts, they are vows made audible. The house does not haunt, it remembers, and memory, when denied release, becomes a kind of presence." She died 3 weeks later of heart failure, found seated in her armchair, facing east, a dried camellia in her lap. Her reel-to-reel tapes vanished from her cottage, though her transcriptions survived, sealed in a tin box beneath the floorboards. Among them was a final note. "The truth is not in the documents, it is in the silence between the notes. Listen there." Her work might have ended with her, buried beneath English reserve and academic skepticism, if not for the chance discovery in 1979 by a BBC sound engineer named Thomas Reed, tasked with digitizing old regional broadcasts. While restoring a 1964 field recording labeled Ashcombe Village Fichi, he isolated an anomalous frequency in the background, 3 descending notes, faint but unmistakable. Tracing the source led him to Miss Vane's name in the library logs, then to her cottage, then to the box beneath the floor. Reed, a man of no particular superstition but deep respect for sonic integrity, spent months analyzing the tapes. He found that when the 3-note phrase was looped and layered with its own echo at precise intervals, it produced a standing wave that resonated with the architectural dimensions of Blackwood Hall's grand staircase, suggesting the melody had been composed, not for ear but for space, as a kind of acoustic key. He visited the hall in the autumn of 1980, recorder in hand. That night, alone in the decaying foyer, he played the reconstructed phrase through a small speaker. The walls did not shake. No specter appeared, but as the final note faded, every door on the ground floor clicked open simultaneously, though none had been latched, and from the west wing, clear as breath against glass, came the sound of 2 footsteps approaching, then stopping just beyond sight. Reed left the hall at dawn, never to return. But before he did, he placed a white camellia on the stone step. It was still there a month later, untouched by frost or decay. The camellia remained not as a relic, but as a recurrence. Every new moon, without fail, a single white bloom appears on the sundial stone in the walled garden of Blackwood Hall, never withering, never disturbed by birds or weather, vanishing only at dawn. No hand has been seen to place it. No root system sustains it. Soil samples taken from the sundial's base reveal nothing but centuries-old mortar and ash. Yet the flower returns, pristine, its petals cool to the touch even in summer, carrying with it the faint scent of beeswax and old paper, the same odor that clung to Dr. Croft's gloves and Miss Vane's journals. Local botanists dismiss it as a trick of light or a prank, though none can replicate it. Historians call it folklore, though it defies the erosion of time that has claimed everything else. But those who have lingered too long near the Holocaustists, sound technicians, stray hikers drawn by a rumor speak of a different truth, that the bloom is not left behind, but remembered into being. For the core of the Blackwood mystery was never incest, not in the crude sense the world imagines. It was fidelity of a kind so absolute it breached the boundary between self and other. Eleanor did not marry her brother. She consented to become the vessel through which his presence might persist, not as ghost, not as impostor, but as echo given form by unwavering witness. The ritual required no incantation, no blood sacrifice, only this, that one person remembered another so completely that absence ceases to be real. In a society that prized lineage above all, the Winthrops had not sought to preserve land or title, but continuity of identity itself, a desperate gambit against oblivion. The church called it heresy. The law called it fraud. But in the silent chambers of that house, it was simply love, twisted by duty into something indistinguishable from haunting. Evidence of this endurance hides in plain sight. In 1874, 6 months after Alistair's disappearance, a letter arrived at the diocesan registry in Norwich, postmarked from Blackwood Hall, requesting a correction to the marriage register. The groom's name was not Alistair Winthrop, but Arthur Charles Winthrop. The request was denied on procedural grounds and filed away, forgotten until Miss Vane unearthed it. The handwriting matched neither Eleanor's nor any known clerk's. It was a fusion, as though two hands had guided the pen. More telling is the estate ledger from that same year, which records a payment to Mrs. Eleanor Winthrop for services rendered to the household. The amount was precise, £372, 6d, the exact sum Arthur had once promised her for managing his correspondence during his illness. She had never been paid in life. The entry was signed with a single initial A. There are other threads, quieter but no less telling. In the attic of St. Etheldradus, wrapped in oilskin, lies a baptismal register from 1875, unsigned and unbound. It lists one entry, child of Arthur and Eleanor Winthrop, stillborn, name withheld by request. The ink is smudged, as though written through tears. But beside the date, someone, perhaps the vicar, perhaps Eleanor herself, has added in the margin, not lost, returned. No grave exists for the child. Yet on the anniversary of that date, villagers report the sound of an infant's cry from the Umays, though no one is there. The cry lasts exactly 17 seconds, the same duration as the three-note phrase when played at the correct tempo. The revelation then is not that Arthur returned from death, but that death was refused not by him, but by her. Eleanor did not conjure a brother. She refused to let him go, and in that refusal shaped a space where memory became substance. That Alistair who walked the grounds was not a man, but a role of performance sustained by her belief so total it bent the world around it. This is why the witnesses saw what they saw, not because they were deceived, but because, for a time, the story was true enough to walk, to speak, to wear a ring of cold metal. And when the strain grew too great, when the world outside could no longer accommodate such devotion, the role dissolved, but the vow remained. It lingers in the architecture, in the acoustics, in the recurring bloom that defies decay. The final proof lies not in documents, but in absence. Since Eleanor's death, no Winthrop has set foot in the hall, not out of fear, but because the line is closed. The peerage was formally extinguished in 1901, the land sold, the title declared extinct. Yet the house stands, untouched by developers, unclaimed by heirs. Insurance assessors who enter for valuation report inexplicable phenomena, compasses spinning, watches stopping, an overwhelming sense of being watched not with malice, but with expectation, as though the rooms await a recognition that never comes. Architects note that the hall's proportions adhere to no known style. Its symmetry is subtly wrong, the eastern wing fractionally longer than the western, as though built to accommodate two people walking side by side, yet never quite touching, and always the sound, not loud, not sudden, but persistent, a fragment of melody drifting through the air on windless nights. Sometimes from the music room, sometimes from the garden, sometimes from no discernible source at all. Those who hear it describe a feeling not of dread, but of profound sorrow, as though the notes carry the weight of a promise kept too well. In 2003, a group of sonic anthropologists installed microphones throughout the property, recording for 6 months. Their findings were inconclusive, save for one anomaly. The three-note phrase appeared only when the house was empty. The moment a human voice entered the recording, the music ceased. It returned only after silence was restored. Today, Blackwood Hall is shuttered, its windows boarded, its gates chained. Yet visitors still come, not tourists but seekers. Those who have lost someone and wonder if love, at its most desperate, might carve a door where none should be. They leave nothing behind but footprints, which the morning mist erases. Except, always, for the camellia on the sundial. It appears regardless of who comes, as though the house remembers its duty even when no one watches. And in the hour before dawn, when the world is hushed and the boundary between memory and presence thins once more, one might stand at the edge of the garden, and hear not footsteps, not voices, but the faint rustle of silk, two figures perhaps walking the path, walked as children hand in hand, stopping where the sundial casts no shadow and waiting, not for resurrection, not for justice, but for someone to say their names together the way they were spoken once in a vow that outlived them both. Arthur and Eleanor, not as brother and sister, not as husband and wife, but as a single silence holding itself intact against the erosion of time.